One of the most important aha moments I had when researching Latin American history is this realization that virtually every aspect of Latin America has been shaped in one way or another by cultural interaction, and sometimes between cultures that are very different. You can see this in the foods of Latin America, the arts, the dance, and, in the case of my research, in religion. For many historical reasons, ranging from the African slave trade to the Spanish conquests, the cultures of Latin America tend to be this mixture between three main cultural groups, in which there is obviously lots of diversity, but to keep it simple, we can think of these as three main cultural groups: African, European, and indigenous. As someone who is very interested in religion and philosophy, I decided to focus on how the religious traditions of these three cultural groups combined into some uniquely new religions that are uniquely Latin American. This process is known as religious syncretism. So what is religious syncretism? Religious syncretism is the process of two or more religious traditions combining to create a new one. Throughout history, religions have routinely borrowed, adapted, and diffused in relation to one another. Seems simple enough, but after delving into the scholarship about religious syncretism, I started to realize that there is definitely some contention in the community about how and why syncretism actually works. Some scholars see religious syncretism as happening in a cultural milieu, this kind of background process that happens when cultures interact. This kind of syncretism is a passive process in which elements from two or more religious traditions naturally and subconsciously blend to create something new. On the other hand, syncretism might be seen as an active process in which agency is wielded by colonial powers or individuals as a conscious means to secure or resist hegemony. I'm aware that this distinction is subtle, to say the least, but it is important for understanding this scholarship. Let's take a look at some of the key historiographical developments in the study of some of Latin America's most iconic syncretic religions. Some historians have argued that religious syncretism happens unintentionally and perhaps even inevitably in a passive process. In this view, different religious belief systems are seen as having started in another area and then blended once they got to Latin America. In his 1968 article, Syncretism and Religious Change, Peel writes, "The process of borrowing, comparison, and adaptation, often between religious systems which differ considerably in their totality, is a consequence of increased intercourse within an area, as a result of war and trade." It's fair to say that war and trade were in no short supply in colonial Latin America. From the age of conquest through the colonial period, when the extraction of wealth and resources is really the foundation of the Spanish Empire. Peel argues that some of the religions interacting in the New World, such as the Yoruba religion from West Africa, was uniquely primed to absorb things from other religions that they came in contact with, such as indigenous beliefs and Catholicism. He argues that this is because Yoruba religion, unlike Christianity, is not necessarily based on faith so much as it is on using the religion as a kind of tool or technique to interact with spirits or cause something to change in real life. Because these West African cultures saw religion as a series of techniques rather than a matter of faith or dogma, they were more willing to try out other religions' techniques. However, Peel does seem to say that this was a passive process. People were not actively seeking out these new techniques. They sort of gradually seeped into these new emerging religions behind the scenes. We can really see how scholarly interpretations of religious syncretism have changed throughout the last century or so when we look at Lynn Smith's article, 3 Specimens of Religious Syncretism in Latin America. Smith includes an excerpt from a traveler in Colombia in 1893, which reads, "In the early days, in order to attract a childlike people who could be appealed to only through the imagination, there was established the custom of celebrating elaborate religious festivals. These were embellished by the playing of melodies in which their musical instruments had a prominent part. the adornments with which they dressed, their grace, and by their aptitude at dancing. The syncretism described in this passage, in which indigenous populations converted to Christianity, keeping only elements of their native religion that were sort of superficial on the surface, like rituals and festivals, is a prime example of what we might call the top-down narrative of religious syncretism. Top-down implies that there is a powerful force at the top, in this case the Christian church, that is exerting its power to convert people below. In such a model, clearly there is very little room for personal agency. Another argument for religious syncretism functioning as a passive process is John Thompson's work on the origins of Santa Muerte. Today, Nuestra Señora de la Santa Muerte, or simply Santa Muerte, is a deity portrayed most often as a hooded female skeleton with flowing robes, occasionally wielding a scythe. While Santa Muerte is ostensibly a Catholic saint, and those who pray to her readily identify themselves as Catholics, some elements typical of her veneration, such as printed spell cards, do not appear entirely orthodox. Now, lucky for us as historians, the Mexican Inquisition kept pretty meticulous records, and these records served as Thompson's primary source. From inquisitorial records, we learned that sorcerers were tried by the Holy Office in Mexico City as early as 1536. In that year, inquisitors tried a Puerto Rican cowherder named Elvira Jimenez for teaching a Mexican widow how to use incantations to procure another husband. This early example of the Inquisition's work poignantly illustrates the Holy Office's ineffectiveness in quashing love magic. Incantations to get a husband, keep him, or render him stupid remain among the most common forms of magic used in Mexico today. This evidence tells us that the Catholic Church was not actually successful in their eradication of folk religion, which is a pretty big blow to the top-down narrative. Santa Muerte is a prime example of religious syncretism in iconography as well. For example, the image of Santa Muerte as a skeleton seems to have evolved gradually over the course of centuries and been drawn from both indigenous and European sources. Here on the left, we see a medieval European piece of art that is expressing anxieties about the Black Death. We have to remember that Europe in the 14th century was absolutely devastated by the Black Death. So there was a lot of anxiety about death in Catholic religious art. At the same time, Aztec cultures also sort of shared this reverence for death in their human sacrifices and some of their religious iconography. This is noteworthy because it shows that two religions don't necessarily have to change in order to syncretize. Sometimes their motifs, in this case skeletons and a preoccupation with death, are well suited to each other and can just sort of combine in a passive process. Some of the evidence that I find the most convincing that religious syncretism might be a passive process comes from Shannon Iverson, an archaeologist. When discussing early interactions between the Catholic Church and indigenous Mesoamericans, she writes, "Two societies faced one another with fundamental misunderstandings. Concepts such as sin were alien to the indigenous peoples, while the Spanish could not understand practices such as sacrifice. Linguistic translation was a theological minefield. The friars also faced very low ratios of monastic to indigenous populations, which made friars' individual ideas and preferences more salient and bred variation. Then, too, there were philosophical differences between the orders themselves, between the orders and the secular priests, and squabbles between the crown and the orders. Most importantly, the friars faced the proactive engagement of indigenous subjects in Christianity, which fundamentally changed the nature of ritual and the nature of Christianity itself." What this amounts to is a New World Christianity that is not nearly as monolithic as historians have usually believed. In fact, it's rather porous and perhaps even fragile, and therefore easily combined and syncretized with elements of indigenous religions. Iverson advances a fairly nuanced concept known as resignification to help explain religious syncretism. Resignification is this idea that concepts are socially constructed, and therefore they take on new meanings in new contexts. It implies that Latin American religions were in constant flux from the moment of encounter. undergoing imperceptible and inevitable changes at the most fundamental level, the level of meaning itself. In other words, concepts such as church or faith might have completely different cultural meanings from one person to the next. Our final argument for religious syncretism as a passive process is a fairly philosophical and even psychological one, and it comes from Eduardo Rosenweg and Lucia Reyes. They argue that Christianization was, above all, a dramatic struggle between forms of consciousness, that of the indigenous communities, a mythologized one unprepared to receive monotheism, with its complex symbol, system, and ritual. The immediate result was a culture of mimetic assimilation, pagan Christianity, and finally, the desolation of consciousness. In other words, a tremendous privatization of the mythologized norms. I know, that is a mouthful, but all it's really saying is that religious syncretism is not a conscious process, and it's not even the result of forced conversion, for example. Rosenweg and Reyes seem to be arguing that the worldview, or at least the spiritual view, of these three main groups in Latin America, blacks, whites, and indigenous, were so different on a fundamental level that they were essentially able to overlay each other without much cognitive dissonance at all. In the latter half of the 20th century, scholarship that argued for religious syncretism as an active process became far more abundant. These active historical perspectives usually focus on seeing things from the point of view of marginalized groups and seeing how those groups used their own individual and cultural agency to direct their religious development. In their 1998 article, Cuban Santeria, Haitian Vodou, and Puerto Rican Spiritualism, historians Perez and Mena adopt a multicultural perspective to help explain how these syncretic religions formed. They argue that while the iconography of Haitian Vodou or Cuban Santeria is clearly both European and African, on a religious level, it's pretty superficial. They write that the different enslaved nations of Africa were forcibly consigned to live in cabildos, where they celebrated their ritual obligations to the orishas, or spirits, by disguising them in Catholic festivities. There, the enslaved created for themselves a facade within the popular culture by which to hide their worship of the Yorubaland ancestor deities. This suggests that in the colonial era, practitioners of Afro-Latin religions concealed and hid the true origins of their religious beliefs. This suggests that religious syncretism in the Caribbean, at least, was not a passive process. Rather, indigenous and enslaved populations used their own agency to define and choose what to embrace and what to leave out of either religious tradition. Afro-Latin religions seem to epitomize this type of active religious syncretism. Andre Drugers has also noted, in the supernatural dimension, the African gods gave to the believers the religious power that was expressed in spirit possession. The identification with Catholic saints reinforced this effect. The power from spirit possession stimulated syncretism, since every spirit medium is a legitimate producer of religion. Here it's important to point out Druger's emphasis on this idea of legitimacy. Who, in any religion, is empowered to create and spread and be an authority on that religion. For instance, in Spanish colonial America, the pool of legitimate producers of Catholicism was rather small, concentrated in and dispensed by an elite Catholic clergy. On the other hand, the pool of legitimate producers in the African religion was comparatively broad. It occurred to me during my research that this decentralized legitimacy seems to be one of the hallmarks of what we might call folk religions. And it does a lot to help explain why so many of these folk religions still seem to exist, even in the shadow of these colossal religions like Christianity or Islam. One of the best places to research Afro-Latin religions is actually Brazil. This is because as a Portuguese colony, Brazil was one of the major importers of African labor during the slave trade from the earliest date. Stephen Selka writes, in Brazil, slaves of the same ethnic groups were typically grouped together. a practice that colonial administrators encouraged as a divide and conquer strategy, intended to preserve ethnic identities in order to prevent the formation of racial ones. This provided a religious superstructure through which Afro-Brazilians could seek spiritual support from Catholic deities as well as the African deities with which they were syncretized. This idea advanced by Selke of the religious superstructure is useful because that is an active tool. The colonial powers are actively manipulating the context in which people are interacting and developing these religious traditions and these ethnic bonds. While this policy likely did contribute to mitigating large-scale slave rebellions, it's difficult to say just how much agency the African slaves had in the formation of these religious traditions, or how much the colonial elites actually were able to foresee the religious syncretism that resulted from it. Whether we choose to adopt an active or a passive perspective on religious syncretism, it's really clear that understanding this kind of process is absolutely vital to understanding Latin American history. But even beyond that, it's vital for understanding human nature, how culture spreads, how we interact with each other, and how we might find common ground. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Peace.